I wasn't supposed to love my professor's daughter. I knew that the moment I saw her, knew it like a physical fact, like the way light slices through the frosted windows of the department lounge in September, catching dust motes and turning them into constellations. I had come to Boston with a plan, a dissertation on chiaroscuro in late Renaissance altarpieces, a fellowship that would be more grind than glory, and a cautious private life that fit neatly between archive hours and the occasional awkward conference dinner. Love, when it happened to other people, arrived with fewer complications. It did not, ideally, involve the family of the woman who was responsible for turning my chapters into something resembling scholarship. Her name was Sofia. The first image I have of her is a handshake, brief, warm, fingers dusted with a little flour from the canapes, and the soft, unexpected thrum of recognition in my palm. She moved like someone who knew stages and entrances, a cellist's economy of motion, each gesture purposeful and unhurried. There was a faint scent, jasmine and sandalwood, that trailed behind her as neatly as a composer's motif. She wore a simple black dress that suggested she might come from a world of rehearsals and dimly lit halls rather than faculty meetings. When she smiled, the room condensed around that small, honest curve of her mouth. The reception that night was textbook departmental sociality, wine in plastic cups, a collage of scholarly earnestness and exhausted delight, old dissertations swapped like trading cards. Catherine Harrison, my advisor, moved through the crowd with practiced grace, exact, incisive questions, an occasional fond jab at someone's method. She introduced us with a measured warmth that was unmistakably maternal and professionally unimpeachable. "Lucy, this is Sofia," she said, as though she were handing me a delicate object that could not be dropped. "She's visiting for a few weeks. She's been working on a concerto that's giving her trouble." Sofia's eyes met mine. They were hazel, flecked with a sudden gold impatience. "Trouble is relative," she said, and there was humor in it, but also something like a dare. She told me later she'd been in Boston only 3 days and already felt the city at her throat, cold, always slightly to the point. In that first conversation, between a loose dissertation joke and a remark about the terrible coffee on the 3rd floor, there was a small electrical thing that made me sharpen my awareness. The timbre of her voice when she spoke about music, the way she used the word motif as if it were a small, tender animal she wanted to handle carefully. If you like true WLW stories of complicated love, stay with me till the end. The first week thereafter was a sequence of small, precise encounters that felt at once accidental and inevitable. I would find her in the department archive room, sitting with a battered backpack and a stack of scores, or at the organ loft of St. Clement's, when a rehearsal spilled into the nave, and she claimed a corner to practice quietly. Once, after a talk on perspective and portraiture, she cornered me with a question that turned out to be less about art and more about how we held ourselves in relation to other people's gazes. "Do you ever think about how the subject in a painting is both seen and seer?" she asked, leaning against a white column, cello case propped obediently at her feet. "Like how the sitter is aware that our act of looking changes them." I remember trying to sound scholarly. "It's what Erwin Panofsky called the reciprocity of vision." "Fine," she interrupted, smiling. "But do you ever feel like you're changing, tensing differently because someone important is looking at your work?" I had to be honest. All the time. There is something disarming about being that candid with a stranger who becomes, in the span of a few coffee-fueled weeks, a mirror. We traded confidences that no seminar would allow, stories of late-night composition marathons that yielded nothing but an ache. The childhood memory of a mother teaching her to press the bow hard enough to make the cello sing without shattering it. We shared favorite paintings. She loved Caravaggio's use of shadow the way one loves someone for an essential flaw, and exchanged playlists that felt like postcards from private cities. Our touch was cautious, codified by consent and tremor. Once, in the library's special collections room, where the microfilm machines hummed like nervous insects, my hand brushed hers as we reached for the same brittle facsimile. It was the softest, most ordinary contact. 2 fingertips, a shared laugh at our clumsiness. But afterwards we sat a little closer. We built a language of glances and small, deliberate acts, swapping notes about a passage of an article, sending midnight text messages of single-line quotations, trading photographs of sun-splashed hands and scratched studio floors. It felt, for the first time in my life, like someone was translating the most intimate parts of me into a language I could understand. There were nights when she would ask me to come to a chamber rehearsal. She played in a local ensemble that met in a converted warehouse just south of the Commons, where the acoustics were wild and generous. I learned to pick out the low, mournful hum of her cello in a folding sea of instruments, the way it anchored and then, subtle as breath, released. Watching her, there was a study in patience. Each bowstroke deliberate, each phrase a slow architecture of feeling. In the lobby afterwards, in the space where the city's winter pressed close, she would put her hands in her pockets and speak in those guarded sentences that had the intimacy of confessions. "I write when I can't sleep," she told me one night, "or when I'm trying to stop myself from sleeping." She laughed and then, abruptly, grew serious. "It's how I make sense of all the things I'm allowed and not allowed to feel." I understood boundaries. I had lived by them my whole graduate career. They kept me presentable, competitive, and general. But after the reception that September, something in me loosened. It wasn't only that she was Sofia, or that she listened with the kind of rapt attention that poets hope for and rarely receive. It was the magnetism of shared solitude, the knowledge that between the piles of books and the clattering rehearsal rooms, someone else kept vigil for the same small, ragged truths. It mattered, too, that Catherine Harrison was not an aloof figure of authority. She had, in the months I'd been at the program, become a kind of demanding lodestar. Exacting in critique, generous in encouragement, seasoned by the kind of patience that comes from decades of reading other people's lives into art. She had a laugh like tempered metal, and when she spoke about a painting, it felt as though she were revealing an organism's heartbeat. I admired her almost to the point of worship. Her seminars had taught me to notice light, as if it were scripture. The complication came into view with a kind of perfunctory, devastating ordinariness. On a rainy Tuesday late in October, Sofia invited me to Catherine's Cambridge home for dinner. "It's casual," she said, as if that word could make things easier. "She's cooking, and I've promised to bring dessert." I remember stepping into the house and feeling as if I had walked into a still life. The linoleum warmth of domestic light, photographs clustered in neat frames, a piano with 2 stacks of scores, tea steam curling like a private punctuation. Catherine moved through the kitchen with a familiarity that made me feel both included and warned. She greeted me with a hug that was brief and cool, then sat beside us during the meal and offered stories about archive trips gone wrong. She asked me about my chapter with a combination of curiosity and command that made it impossible to lie. The evening was an intimate, domestic choreography, nothing more and nothing less, until dessert. I had placed the plate carefully on the table. Sofia reached across and her fingers brushed mine. The brush was accidental, unremarkable. Catherine made a laugh, something dry, and in its texture I thought I saw an edge. Later, when we cleared the plates, Catherine asked to speak with me in the study. The light in that room was a little too sharp. The portraits on the walls seemed to watch. "Lucy," she began, in that voice that curbs enthusiasm with principle, "I've noticed a familiarity developing." Her sentence was a scalpel. I understood before she finished. To her, familiarity could mean any number of graduate student acquaintances. But the look in her eyes, soft with maternal concern, hard with professional clarity, shifted the beam. "It's not appropriate," she said. "Not, at least not without boundaries." She didn't accuse. She observed, catalogued, set a parameter. She spoke of conflict of interest and of the vulnerability that inheres in supervisory relationships. She spoke of the department's fragile politics, the reputations that could be ravaged by rumor. She spelled out terms, not in a judgely voice, but in one threaded by personal weariness. I want you to be successful. I will be your advisor, and that role has to be preserved. Catherine's approach was measured, but it was also human. She did not demand that feelings be erased. She demanded a form of containment. 5 months, she said finally, and the weight the phrase carried was heavy as a ledger. We will distance professionally. There can be no co-authorship, no public mentorship for that period. We need to preserve the integrity of your work and of our department. When she said the words, I felt something cold and pregnant settle in my chest. 5 months. It was both an eternity and a manageable unit of time. September to graduation compressed into a single decisive coil. I had the naive certainty that love obeys some kind of arithmetic, the idea that if you waited enough, if you loved carefully and quietly, everything would align. Catherine's demand made that arithmetic real, a 6-letter sentence made of discipline and consequence. I left that evening with my dissertation notes folded in my bag, and a new knowledge nested like a splinter in my palm. Catherine had not forbade her daughter's company. She had forbade the professional proximity that could render my work suspect. The moral map was clearly drawn, but the terrain beneath my feet had shifted. How does one navigate a city that has altered overnight? Sofia found me on the steps of the department, leaning against the oak, the old gargantuan tree behind the humanities building that everyone called the Oak even though it had no name. Its trunk was gnarled with the kind of age you can feel in your bones. We had met there before, under its green cathedral of leaves, exchanging small confidences and cigarette-less puffs of silence. That night, the street lamps haloed the branches, and the taste of rain was still on the air. You saw her, Sofia said. She was less composed than usual, something like a tremor under the calm. Her hands were in her coat pockets. She chewed the inside of one cheek in a way that made me want to wring my hands around her and keep them warm. She offered an arrangement, I answered. Truthful, emotionally partial, morally complicated, but true. 5 months of professional distance. She let out a breath that sounded part laugh, part sob. 5 months, she repeated, as if love were a shelf we can close. Do you think it's fair? She shrugged. Fairness is not often part of either music or academia. Then softer. Will you follow it? It strikes me now how capacious that question was. To follow it would be to prioritize the work, the dissertation, the citations, the method, over the immediacy of desire. To defy it would be to stake my professional future on the fragile belief that love could be carefully sheathed from rumor. Both choices were acts of faith. Both carried cost. We talked until the street emptied and the lamps hummed. We weren't notable to anyone passing by. 2 students clinging to the branches of a campus night. She said the most honest things between the lamplight's blurs. That she'd always known her mother's standards, that Catherine's vigilance came from a place of love compounded with fear, and that the 5-month rule, painful as it was not arbitrary. She didn't want to be the reason my name sat at the center of whispered conference gossip. She did not want me to resent the mother who had done so much for my career. We can do many things that aren't professional, she said finally. We can write each other. We can meet under the oak. Her attempt at levity was brittle enough to be almost beautiful. We can be clandestine poets. Consent in our small universe was declared at every step. We decided, together, to honor Catherine's boundary. There was a desperation under our agreement, an ache that made me think of paintings in which light fights its way across a dark canvas. Small, determined, luminous. We would treat the 5 months as an experiment in restraint. We would test, and we would see what remained. That night we kissed, in a manner both cautious and raging. It needed to be emphasized. Everything we did in full agreement, with questions and approvals, with whispers and laughing apologies. The kiss was itself a negotiation, It acknowledged the terms Catherine had set, without consenting to their finality. When we parted, it was with the precise sting of someone who had both gained and forfeited something in the same breath. The first weeks of the arrangement were a study in calibration. We devised rules so that we could feel like lovers without inviting scandal. No public displays where colleagues might see us. No visible signs on faculty pages. No social media evidence that could be screenshot or misread. We read each other's mail, literally, handwritten notes traded like smuggled letters in a pre-digital romance. We developed codes. A single red pin on a scarf meant, "I need to talk." A photo of a page number sent at midnight conveyed a particular longing. There was an intimacy to the secrecy, an eroticism built entirely from restraint. We met in the greenhouse at the botanical garden, where the humidity pressed the scent of jasmine into everything, and the palms made us feel as if the world had been reduced to a microcosm of our breath. She would play fragments of a newly composed motif into my phone voice memos, 2 measures, then a silence, and I would send back a line from a sonnet I'd loved since I was 16. We kept our fingers deftly crossed that the pattern of our meetings would not be discerned. But there were cracks. Rumor is a patient animal. Once, on a paper about altarpieces, a colleague made an offhand joke that landed like a pebble in a pond. "Isn't it difficult to write under the watchful eye of the one who judges your light?" They laughed. I did not. It is surprising in retrospect how much of our courage is made of noise, the clatter of conferences and the hum of the photocopier. The larger the public noise, the more precarious the private. One evening, an almost accident threw the thin veil of our secrecy into a harsher light. I was at the practice room when someone knocked, the study's antiquated latch making a sound like a relieved breath. I had my notes spread, maps of light and shadow scrawled with punishing precision. When the door opened, it was Catherine. She stood in the doorway as if placed there by fate, rather than by timing. Her hair was in that loose, careless knot she only wore at home. Her eyes took in the room, then my hands, then the cello case in the corner. For a minute, the world aligned into a single sympathetic chord. "Catherine," I said. "Lucy." She folded some invisible piece of herself, sighed, and closed the door behind her. She sat opposite me, and for a moment we merely watched one another, the silence articulate. Then she spoke, and what she said was not accusation, but bruised honesty. "I gave you a boundary," she said, "a professional one. But kindness compels me to speak of the personal as well." She folded her hands like a woman gathering papers before a reading. "I am not blind to what passes between you and Sofia. I will not pretend she is not dear to me. But I also know the sharpness of rumor and the ruin it can bring to a young scholar who is only beginning." She did not soften. Her words were tempered by the same quality I admired in her seminars, clarity married to a tenderness I suspect came from having made choices herself. "Please," she said, "honor the distance." There was a plea in it, a fear as well. I tried to answer with the truth of my heart. "I will," I said, though inside my mouth the word collapsed and rewrote itself. I wanted to say more, that love had already bloomed, that it was not a thing I could fold back into the book of my obligations. But I stopped. The ethics of my field had become an axis. Its gravity tugged hard. After she left, I sat in that practice room a long time, tracing the outline of the cello's scroll with my thumb until my fingertips felt raw. I thought of the 5 months like a patient, necessary wound that would heal into scar tissue bearing testimony to discipline. I did not, in that first breath of resolve, foresee how the wound might fester with doubt. Weeks followed with a pattern I had not known before, the discipline of absence. We honored the rules we had set, which made the moments of meeting smaller and peculiarly more intense. In the spaces between, I read her letters, thin pages folded like promises, and memorized the cadence of her handwriting. We traded an odd intimacy, the knowledge of each other's schedules, the silent counting of time until I defended, until the academic year folded into commencement. She would send me recordings of her practice, quick improvisations caught between breaths, and I would listen in the dark, pressing the phone to my chest as if it were a living animal. The department's semester trudged on. My chapters grew longer and more precise. I learned how to carve sentences that could withstand the microscope of peer review. Yet part of my head was always elsewhere, on a melody she'd hummed, on the smell of sandalwood that lingered in her scarf, on the way her hand had slid along the oak's bark, leaving a faint residue of warmth. I found myself cataloging those moments like research notes. I kept a private ledger of feelings that had the analytical rigor of an academic appendix. There were practicalities, too. The mentorship relationship was reorganized in the formal sense. Catherine officially deferred supervisory meetings for the defined period, and Dr. Peterson stepped in as an interim reader for method sections. It was a patchwork solution that preserved public clarity while exacting a private cost. I was grateful, we all were, for the structural fix. Grateful and bitter in equal measure. Grateful because the career I had worked to build did not unravel overnight. Bitter because the thing that made me feel most alive had been consigned to the footnotes. One fog-soaked November afternoon, I found Sofia waiting for me at the old oak again, her cello case at her feet, a scarf like a strip of dusk around her neck. Her eyes were puffy in a way that suggested she had been crying earlier. Her breath came in small white clouds. "Show me what you're working on," she said, as if that were the best remedy for everything. She opened her case and drew out a single sheet of music. The motif, when she played it, had the brittle brilliance of an object recovered from deep water. Quick arpeggios, a delayed cadence that made the heart stumble. She played in small segments, her bow articulating each note as if it were a word in a long apology. We spoke quietly after. "You're keeping things contained," she observed. "Are you okay?" "I'm okay," I lied, and the lie tasted like old varnish. "I've never been more focused." She smiled, that reposeful smile reserved for people who have learned the meaning of endurance. Then she reached across and pressed her hand to mine, a brief, decisive clasp. "Lucy," she said, "if you get to your defense and you're someone else because you didn't let yourself love, I'll resent Catherine forever." The sentence landed like a bell. For a moment, I thought of all the hypothetical versions of myself that my training had designed. The scholar who sacrifices her nights for footnotes. The person who curates a life of professional achievements at the expense of messy, human things. I did not want to arrive at my defense as someone hollowed out by absence. I wanted to be the integrated woman who could hold a book in one hand and another person's heartbeat in the other. Instead of resolving, we both doubled down on the complexities of our limited rebellion. We attended each other's small victories in stealth. I appeared in the third row of a chamber concert, backless and shadowed. She adjusted the strap of a dress for me in a hallway, eyes bright with the private joy of an illicit conspirator. The world around us assumed nothing except our general studiousness. We were invisible, and thus, perversely, very intimate. And yet, as October slid into November and the nights grew longer, an anxiety threaded through the fabric of our days. There is a peculiar psychology to waiting. It sharpens petty things into crises. A delayed reply, an indeterminate silence, a friend's unplanned absence. We read the small signs as portents. Once, I misread a logic of timing and showed up at a hall where she had planned to practice. She wasn't there. My chest pounded in the empty vestibule as if I had run. The absence made a loud sound. I started noting emergency contacts and mentally rehearsing apologies for a scandal I had not yet caused but knew was possible. The months crept on. The oak turned from green to brittle russet, and then to naked winter branches. I buried myself in the archive. The dissertation took on the shape of a living thing. Chapter by chapter it bled and coalesced, until the footnotes made sense and the argument had the stubborn coherence of a resolved composition. I would sit at the microfilm machines until the lights dimmed, then walk home through streets that smelled faintly of fried bread and wet leaves, thinking of a bow moving across strings. One bitter afternoon in December, something happened that changed the geometry of waiting. A letter arrived at my desk, a formal, bureaucratic letter asking me to appear for an early method review. It was scheduled 2 weeks before what I had planned. Panic, like a small animal, had nested in me. The sudden acceleration of the timeline was disorienting. I began to think in terms of compressed consequences. If my defense were to be sooner, that meant the 5 months would still be in effect, and the window for a public, unproblematic conclusion would shrink. I called Sofia immediately and left her a message folding itself in on itself with panic and irony. When she answered, her voice was steady. "We will plan," she said. "We will be careful." Her steadiness calmed me in a way rationality otherwise could not. There was something about the way she took arrangements seriously that made me trust her, as if she were a vessel anchored in logic and warmth at once. We contrived plans like architects of a life under constraint. Contingency plans for readings, coded signifiers, alternate schedules for meetings that would not put us under public scrutiny. I'm telling this as a story anchored in months and seasons, but there was a private calendar that also mattered, a ledger of small rituals that counted for everything. We kept each other's records. The exact time a draft was emailed, the number of pages turned in a chapter, the phrase we used when one needed to back away. We learned to be lovers in a world that insisted on public cleanliness, and we made privacy a craft. And then, just when we thought the architecture of our agreement could hold, something inevitable intruded. It was Catherine who called me in early January, asking to meet. There was no reproach in her voice, only an exhausted clarity. "Lucy," she said, "I want to tell you something I haven't told you yet. I braced myself for a new requirement, a reinvocation of rules I had already tried to obey. Instead, she offered an account of her life. She spoke of her youth, of a time when she had loved a person who made choices that thwarted more than her heart. She spoke of mistakes, of professional ruin narrowly avoided. She told me about the sacrifices she had made to carve a career that could sustain a student like me. I am not trying to punish you," she said. "I am trying to give you structure so you can be safe, because that is the duty I have, both as a mother and as an advisor." There was a tenderness in her language that made me feel more vulnerable than any accusation could have. She was afraid for us, for me, for the fragile things that could be derailed by gossip. I wanted to tell her everything, that the 5 months felt like a stipulation drafted from fear, that I could love both my work and a person at once, that to be asked to choose carried the same death as being denied. But what I said was more limited. "I understand." Catherine's face softened. "I want you to have what you want," she said, without anyone saying later that you took advantage of circumstance. That was the moral shape of her argument, to prevent harm by preemptive boundaries. It had the cruelty of kindness. We left the meeting with the terms of the 5 months intact and an unspoken agreement that we would attempt to live as if the division between our private feeling and public life were porous but respected. It made me both grateful and bereft. Gratitude because someone with the authority to make my path harder chose instead a path of restraint. Bereavement because the path of my heart had been given a timetable. February came, and with it a peculiar thaw. The snow melted into thin sheets of mud, and the city had the soft, bruised color of a chapel in winter. We continued our rituals. I spent days in the reading room and nights in the quiet of my apartment, listening to recordings she sent. Small fragments, a motif that repeated itself like a pulse. The music became something like a backbone for me. It steadied my focus, and paradoxically, made the waiting more intense. There is an intimacy to hearing someone's hands make art. It is the nearest thing to hearing their voice whisper your name. It was in one of these February afternoons, when the light slanted with the bruised gold of winter, that I had a small epiphany about the ethics of love. We had sacralized our waiting, given it a structure and a moral vocabulary. Yet love, I discovered, is not always obedient to structures. It leaks. It erodes. It inscribes new patterns across whatever scaffolding you build. I had thought restraint would protect us, but restraint also reforms longing into a new, sharper thing. The 5 months was not an erasure. It was a lens that refracted the love into something painfully bright. At the end of that month, I received word that my method review had gone well enough to schedule the full defense for April. That knowledge was a small joy, an end in view, a completion point that allowed me to map the next steps with the icy precision of someone who loves to plan. Yet the calendar's forward motion made me anxious in another way. It made me hyper-aware of the time still to pass, of the boxes to check, and the citations to shore up. I tell you all this because the narrative of our love is not only about grand gestures. It is comprised of an accumulation of small decisions and the way those decisions wear on you, the way you learn to be patient as if patience were an art form. There were dinners with colleagues where our names were both mentioned and not. There were orchestrations of private readings and public absences. Each small victory in the archive felt like a coral reef formed beneath the sea. Slow, almost invisible daily accretion that, in time, solidifies into something that can support weight. On a wet evening at the end of March, when the campus smelled like crushed earth and coffee, I found myself at the oak again. Sofia was there, leaning against the trunk. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold or from a rehearsal, perhaps both. She pulled a sheet of music from her bag and, without looking up, said, "We will not be strangers after April." "I know," I said. I wanted to say more, about fear, about the small deaths you practice through abstinence, but instead kept my words to a steady, factual rhythm. She came closer, and for a moment we simply breathed the same air. The oak folded us into its branches the way a picture frames its subject, and the sky above was the hard, brittle blue that belongs to that time of year, when everything feels possible and precarious at once. "You believe in my work," she said suddenly, and there was more to that sentence than music. "Even when I don't." I wanted to tell her that yes, I believed in her, in every tremulous phrase she composed, in the ways she turned dissonance into the ache of a question asked well. I wanted to say I believed in her not because she was Catherine's daughter, but because she was her own person. Persistent, strange, wholly human. But instead we held our peace, because we had learned that silence, for now, preserved us. The months narrowed. April came, and with it, the brittle, bright terror of near completion. As I prepared chapters and conclusions, I felt the gravitational pull of both my career and my heart tightening into a single axis. The defense loomed like a proscenium arch. Step through it correctly, and a new act would begin. And there, on a pale afternoon as the last of the winter wind fled the city, I sat at my desk with the final chapter open and heard my phone buzz. It was a message from Sofia, a photo of the oak's bark, taken close enough that you could see the grooves. Under it, she had written one word: wait. It was both a benediction and a challenge. The 5 months were almost done. The calendar was folding itself into a new shape. My heart, which had been practicing patience as if it were a virtue, had become an impatient thing, trying to compress longing into stolen syllables. I closed my laptop and walked outside. The campus smelled of late thaw and library dust. I thought of the way Catherine had watched me at her home, the look that was not a reprimand, but a fear. I thought of the way Sofia could find the exact moment in a rehearsal where she could make the orchestra's breath hitch. I thought about how choices erected by love and by law could do the work of both saving and breaking us. Standing under the oak, with its branches spread like an old necessary shelter, I felt the full metric of the situation settle in. The 5 months would end, but what would come after was not certain. Would Catherine soften? Would she nosed into our private weather and find it wanting? Would the department's small-town gossip turn a tender thing into scandal? Thinking of this, my resolve hardened like a tempered blade. I had worked for years to be here. I would not squander what I had earned. But neither could I deny what I had found. We had decision to make, and I carried it like a manuscript beneath my arm. Pages of argument and feeling, all of it to be defended. The defense would be an intellectual labor. The life that waited afterward would be an ethical one. I took out my phone and typed, slowly, a line that made my fingers tremble. "I'll be ready. I'll be ready." The words felt like a small, stubborn prayer as I walked back to my desk. The oak's bark had been photographed and texted. The tree, which had been a place of secret currency between us for months, had become for a moment a shared talisman that promised continuity. April was a bright, merciless month in New England, light that clarified instead of forgiving, the sort of light that renders the edges of things exact. It was the perfect light for a defense, and the worst imaginable light for hiding. In the days before the defense, my world narrowed into a precise geometry. I wrote and revised as if I were carving marble from a block. The sentences had to stand on their own. My advisor's absence, Catherine's careful retreat, had created an odd, almost holy quiet. Dr. Peterson stepped into the formal role with the kind of competent neutrality that academics practice like a religion. He asked the right questions in meetings. How does your argument reshape the iconography of light? Have you reconciled your readings of Caravaggio with the archival material from the Sforza Chapel? His tone was professional and unexpectedly protective in the way colleagues can be toward one another when they perceive vulnerability. Sofia's presence in my life during those weeks was a study in containment. She would appear, sometimes at dawn, sometimes late at night, as if she had learned how to be punctual to devotion. We had a calendar in our heads that decided the times we could be holy ourselves. A Sunday morning walking route through the North End, a half-hour in the botanical garden greenhouse when the humidity wrapped us like a secret, a quick exchange of a printed sonnet folded into the pocket of my coat before a seminar. Our notes felt softer, more urgent. Lines of music sent with, "For when you need breath," a photograph of her hands ink-stained from scribbling on new scores, a single word, "steady," when my anxiety skittered. She left me a voicemail the week I was polishing the introduction. Her voice trembled a little when she spoke, a sound that had nothing to do with fear for the work, and everything to do with the ache we'd been living in. "You will be brilliant," she said, and in that small sentence, she became both booster and balm. "I'll be beneath the stage of your sentences, wherever and whenever I can." Those words were literal nonsense and precise comfort. A cellist beneath the stage, listening to arguments reverberate. We traded small ironies like that. Language was another instrument we practiced together. On the morning of the defense, I woke before dawn because nerves are an animal that do not respect sleep. The city was still quiet, the kind of blue that feels ancient and cold. I dressed in clothing that made me feel like myself. Simple, disciplined, unadorned. A black skirt, a white blouse, and a cardigan my mother had given me the Christmas I left home. I ate nothing more than a slice of toast, and carried with me the kind of calm that is built on ritual. Walking into the committee room was like stepping into a painting. The light fell through the high windows in strips. The professors sat like consuls behind a long table. Dr. Peterson offered me a small, encouraging smile. There was no Catherine in the room. Her decision to step back had been consistent. In her place, there was an absence that felt both protective and punitive. Protective because she had tried to guard me from compromised judgment. Punitive because the absence was another kind of discipline I had to endure. I presented my thesis as I had practiced. A map of shadows and assertions that ran from the hushed altarpieces of lesser-known Franciscan chapels to the dramatic, theatrical gestures of Caravaggio. I argued for a way of seeing light as an agent rather than a mere technique. When the questions came, they were sharp and sometimes perfunctory, sometimes nakedly curious. I answered each one as if I were aligning brushstrokes, accurate, modest, and with an insistence on the thing I had discovered in my research. Towards the end, Dr. Peterson levied a question that surprised me. It was gentle, and, for reasons I couldn't name then, seemed to reach beyond the manuscript. How does your own experience of looking shape your reading of these images? A laugh bubbled out of me, short and honest. It shapes everything, I said. The sentence was small and dangerous, an admission that scholarship is not a purely disembodied enterprise. When I finished, the room held its breath for the kind of moment that academics sometimes grant one another, the decision to pass or to press forward. They passed me. It felt absurdly ceremonial. Handshakes, a printed certificate, the practical instructions for revisions that would take me into the summer. I left the building with a series of congratulatory emails and a small, absurd giddiness lodged behind my ribs. Our 5 months were technically over. The constraint had been honored. The world had one less ethical barrier to strain at, but the weather outside the committee room was the same in its rawness as it had been all morning. I called Sofia before anyone could call me. She picked up on the third ring. For a moment, we both laughed like people who have been allowed to resume breathing. "We did it," she said. The words were both celebration and an indexical trace of the tension released. "Now you can have me without caveats. And you could have me without footnotes," I replied, foolish and tender. We met under the oak that afternoon, and the tree, noticing our relief, seemed to loosen its branches. We stood in a small, ridiculous silence, two people who had measured out their months by discipline, and had now, almost hesitantly, to reckon with the new shape of time. "You could come to Cambridge next week," she said, almost too casually. "There's a residency, a short thing. It's not professional in the sense that it would intersect with your advisor. It's more public." The invitation was a test in itself. It was harmless, and in another life, it would have been ordinary. We laughed at the idea of public outings and private joys interlacing. We walked until the sky lost its brightness, and the campus lights blinked awake. There was a nervousness between us now that was not entirely about the past. It was about what comes after constraint, the small negotiations of a newly permissible affection. How would we take up space together in the world without edges cut by others' hands? Plans felt possible. It was around this time, in the fragile space between relief and newness, that the world intruded with the sort of private tragedy that reframes ineffable things into urgent decisions. The news came by a phone call. Sofia's voice, when she said the name, was too small. In the easy world of metaphors, we had spoken of accidents as if they were literary devices. Now, an accident was raw and irreducible. The person who died was someone from Sofia's ensemble, a violinist named Mara who had been part of the group's structural architecture, a woman who laughed at rehearsal like a bell and left her music open on stands like invitations. There had been a car accident on an icy road. Mara was on her way home from a gig. It was sudden and terrible and senseless in the cold, mechanistic way such losses often are. The grief that followed was not cinematic. It resisted neat verbs. Sofia's sorrow came as a quietness that replaced music with a raw absence. In the days after, rehearsal spaces felt like homes with missing furniture. People's faces seemed to go wrong when they tried to assemble comforting words. The ensemble held a small, impromptu vigil in a church where the candles made the shadows long and tremulous. I sat in the back and felt the cello in my lap like a weight I wasn't entitled to. It was the fear of losing more, of futures truncated, of the unpredictability of accidents that pressed at both of us in ways the 5 months had not. The promise of being deliberate and patient now collided with the finite nature of life. We found ourselves whispering the same terrible calculus. What if we waited and lost our chance not to rumor, but to death? What if the universe offered a chance, and then, with uncanny cruelty, took it away? Sofia's grief had the tendency to become clarity. She began to speak with a voice sharpened by the fragility she had watched at close range. "I don't want to leave thinking I hesitated," she told me in the kitchen of my small apartment. Her scarf hung on a chair like a trailing thought. I don't know what the right compromises are, Lucy. I only know that Mara is gone, and that's a kind of wake-up call. She pressed her palms together like someone trying to steady a tremor. We can keep being careful, but I can't keep living as if timing is our only morality. The conversation that followed was not a breaking of the rules so much as a negotiation on new terms. We both wanted to honor Catherine's professionalism and to avoid causing harm to my career. But grief had made the calculus more acute. If sorrow was a moral agent, it demanded that we not waste the time we had. In the weeks that followed, Sofia received an offer from a chamber program affiliated with a university in New Haven. It was not a long-term tenure-track post or a dramatic promotion. It was a position that offered stability and proximity, an opportunity to be part of a broader musical community that included a conservatory and ties to a well-regarded orchestra. Yale was a name that carried weight, and for anyone in our corner of the world, New Haven was shorthand for a place where art and academia collided in interesting and sometimes tortured ways. She wavered, naturally. The decision felt momentous in the context of everything else. Our secrets, our commitments, the way we'd learned to love in measured units. It was also an answer to a fear I could barely articulate, the fear of losing a person to the small violences of distance. If Sofia accepted New Haven, our connection could be public in ways it hadn't been, and we could build a life that didn't require coded scarves and clandestine notes. But the decision asked for courage. She would be moving into a space with its own old hierarchies and her own set of demands. We walked again under the oak, which at that time of year was beginning to sprout tentative leaves. If I go, she said, it won't be because I want to run from what happened. It will be because I want to make something from it. She spoke as if she were naming a duty, not a mere personal whim. I want to be somewhere that has room for my music. And for us. Her voice carried both resolve and a fear I recognized intimately. There were practicalities, audition dates, travel schedules, the awkwardness of telling Catherine something that felt both inevitable and scary. There were also moral dilemmas. Catherine had been a force in both our lives. She had been my mentor and Sofia's mother. She had shaped careers and held people's reputations like fragile glass. How would she receive the news that her daughter might be moving nearer to the woman she had just admonished to distance herself? We did not cloak the move in deceit. We told Catherine, in a conversation that was winded with caution. She received the news with the same deliberation she brought to all difficult things. There was a moment in which she closed her eyes and seemed to measure a ledger only she could see. This may well be the best solution, she said finally. There was no thrill in her voice, but there was a thing close to relief. Geography can be kinder than gossip. If the position allows you to perform and to grow, if it will not destabilize the department, then perhaps it is prudent. She asked for particulars, as all good advisors do. Duration, obligations, whether the affiliation would create any conflicts. There was a carefulness in her questions that was not the coldness of an enemy, but the precision of someone who had been burned by too much imprecision before. Then she watched Sofia as if she were both mother and arbiter. I cannot promise you unconcern, she said at the end of the conversation, and her admission felt like a tiny crack opening in a wall built against fear. But I will try to trust that your choices are made with care. For the first time since that rainy October night, I felt a shift in the moral balance. Catherine's words did not immediately absolve the past, nor did they erase the ethics of our early months. But they offered, in their unadorned way, a kind of permission, the permission to be truthful in public while preserving the professional rigor that had been demanded. It was a conditional acceptance, threaded through with worry and maternal love, but acceptance nonetheless. Sofia accepted the position. We moved with a strange intensity in those final weeks before graduation. There were boxes and goodbyes and nights of packing where we read each other poems as if we were packing the heart for the road. The department held a low-key toast for my defense. Catherine was there, and her handshake with me contained both admonition and respect. We made a ritual of small things: the last cup of tea in a chipped mug, the final reading of a favorite sonnet, the last time we would walk together under the oak as campus students. When May arrived, the campus had the messy joy of commencement. There are few ceremonies that make the texture of a town feel so small and so enormous at once. Chairs were arranged on the quad. A band warmed up in the distance. Parents fussed and took photographs as if they were trying to press memory into film. The oak, older than any of us, watched with a patience that made the whole exercise of adulthood seem like a language it already understood. My graduation was a study in light again, but this time it was kinder. I walked across the stage with the measured gait that years of academic practice instill. People clapped. I felt my mother in the crowd, a face I had known in frames of my childhood watching me as if I weren't fully real. When the ceremony allowed mingling, there was an entire choreography of congratulations. Hugs from committee members. Furtive. Bright messages from friends who had been in the margins of our months. We decided to meet beneath the oak after the ceremony. It felt like a proper place to name transitions, both for the world and for us. Under its spreading boughs, with the campus in a kind of festive blur around us, Sofia stood with a small envelope in her hand. The envelope had the dull, official color of things that matter. "I was offered a position at Yale," she said. It was not a triumphant shout, but a steady announcement. "They want me on their chamber roster next season. It's a contract." There were a dozen things held in that single fact: hope, work, proximity. The name Yale carried weighty histories and complicated politics, but for us it meant a possibility: doctoral work, residencies, a community that would respect music as a craft and as a life. It meant we could be together without the need to consign our affection to margins. Catherine approached us at that moment. She had watched much of the day like someone evaluating light across a canvas, focusing, noting, weighing. When she came near, she looked at Sofia first, and then at me, with the expression that combined mothering and professional scrutiny. I braced, because even with all the growth of the intervening months, there was no way to fully escape the vigilance of someone who had once set a boundary as a protective device. "You were very careful," she said to Sofia in that tempered voice. "You honored what I asked for, and you also. I see you." Her acknowledgement was smaller than the reconciliation I hoped for, but it had substance. It recognized our patience and our grief, and the way we had tried to build a life that did not trade honesty for deceit. "I will not pretend everything is without risk," she added, "but I would be lying if I said I did not imagine how your music might flourish in a place like New Haven." Sofia answered her with something simple. "I want to play my music, and I want Lucy with me. I don't want to have to choose." Catherine's eyes softened. The mother in her, honed by experience, had the capacity to see both the person before her and the consequences of choices. There was a long pause, the sort of silence that holds the shape of decisions before they land. "Then let us be adults about this," Catherine said at last. "I want us to have clarity. If you two are to be public in New Haven, then you will not expect me to be anything other than a mother who cares. And Lucy, I will remain your advisor in spirit, and, as appropriate, in practice. But there will be boundaries until we all learn how to be at ease with this arrangement. That is my condition." It wasn't absolution, nor did it need to be. It was a practical settlement that allowed for dignity. There were terms, conversations yet to be had about co-authorship and public appearances, but there was, importantly, room for life. We stepped away from the oak, and in that movement, the canopy above seemed to breathe. People filed past in a tide of academic finery. Confetti of some sort fluttered from a distance, stuck like pale snowflakes to jackets. We were not free of complication, but we were freed from the strictness of seductive secrecy. The possibility of building something ordinary, and thus extraordinary, felt within reach. Our move to New Haven was a slow boarding of a long voyage. The first weeks were intoxicatingly domestic and awkward in equal measure, assembling furniture in a small apartment with too many bookshelves, learning the rhythm of each other's mornings, discovering the precise way a kettle whistles that can make the ordinary feel like punctuation. There were dinners with colleagues where introductions were made with an ease that made me giddy with the freedom to say, "This is my partner," without hedging. Professionally, the city welcomed us with its own complicated hospitality. Sofia rehearsed and performed. She taught a few master classes and took on composer collaborations that left her fingers aching in the best possible way. Among the small memorable things was the night of her chamber piece premiere, where the notes she had worked through in whispered fragments over months resolved into a full, aching statement. I sat in the audience, my hands folded into each other's warmth, feeling like the vessel of a music I had helped keep safe in private. My own work transitioned too. The dissertation revisions were demanding but mercifully finite. The footnotes once feared became friends I could now invite to the table. The book, an adaptation of my thesis, more public and more intimate than a dry scholarly monograph, found a small press willing to publish a text that balanced academic rigor with the lyricism I'd learned to practice in the dark months. The process of revision and publicity, and the way a book's spine feels new and alive, are small pleasures that join with larger ones. Catherine visited twice that first season. Our meetings were tentative at first. She remained someone who listened for the small, dangerous sign of professional compromise. But at dinners in our small kitchen, she would discuss exhibition catalogs or recent scholarship while also asking about Sofia's new compositions. There were moments, small, domestic, mundane, where she would pour tea and tease an anecdote about the year she nearly missed tenure because she had been foolish in love. The story, told with a rueful laugh, opened a crack we all leaned into. The humor did not erase the past, but it humanized it. Acceptance was not, and never had been, instantaneous. There were conversations that stretched in time, glances that required negotiation, and a stubborn, residual wariness in some circles that took longer to dissolve than others. There were also moments of small courage. A panel invitation where Catherine introduced both Sofia and me without a perfunctory pause, a colleague who asked me at a symposium about the ethical labor of mentorship and nodded as if new possibilities were unfolding, a friend who said privately, "I'm glad you didn't make the sacrifice they expected." We were not a tidy emblem of resolution. There were fights, petty and honest, about household chores and professional jealousies, about the small ways ambition and affection can collide. Sometimes the best way I noticed the depth of our bond was in the small mercies. A cup of coffee made precisely the way I liked it after a sleepless night, a recording sent at 2 a.m, a hand placed on my shoulder in an auditorium when a difficult question came at me during a public talk. The motifs that had marked our beginning, the jasmine that clung to Sofia's scarf, the scent of sandalwood on the evening she arrived at my desk, the low, patient hum of the cello, became woven into the fabric of ordinary living. When I read footnotes aloud while she tuned her cello, it felt less like 2 lives in the same apartment and more like a duet. The oak's memory stayed with us too. On the anniversary of my defense, we drove back to the campus and sat under the same branches as if to thank a tree for its patience. The bark had deepened in ridges, and the bench was warmed by the sun. Our conversation was gentle, as if the tree had sanctified that softness. Time, in that particular diagnosis of life, is a teacher of slow miracles. The sting of early months settled into a lived ethic. We had chosen to honor boundaries during the most dangerous part of our entanglement, and in doing so, we had not escaped consequence. Rather, we had transformed consequence into something like trust. Catherine's willingness to re-enter our orbit without sacrificing her principles showed the truth that authority and love need not be eternally polarized. Her watchfulness became, in small measures, a form of care. Years later, I will still think of music when I try to explain us. There is a phrase in music theory called counterpoint, 2 lines that are independent, yet harmonize. That metaphor felt applicable for the type of life we constructed. Each of us maintained our separate trajectories, our own teachers and projects, but our lives sang against each other in ways that made new harmonies possible. There were public moments, reviews that praised Sofia's work, a small citation of my book in a journal I admired, a photograph in a local paper of us walking into a gallery opening. There were quieter milestones too. The first time her mother called her to say she'd been proud at a concert, the night we hosted a small dinner, and Catherine stayed much later than she intended because she was engaged in the conversation. The morning I signed the contract for the book's U.S. release and found a note from Sofia tucked in the margin. We are living. Not all things were smoothed. There were jabs of old suspicion. A rumor that started in a way that felt like a ghost from our graduate days. The petty misunderstandings with colleagues who had difficulty seeing our partnership as anything other than impropriety. We learned resilience, not the brittle kind, but the durable, everyday sort. We countered whispers with work and with the ordinary courage of continuing. In quieter moments, when the world was less insistent and the room was filled with the small white noise of a refrigerator and the distant hum of urban traffic, we would sit and listen to a recording of a piece Sofia had written in the early days, the motif she had allowed me to hear in private, and which later became a public phrase in a chamber piece. The melody had the quality of a memory, repeating, refracting, returning with changes each time. It was, to my ears, a perfect map of the way love had been tested and had matured. We celebrated the little domesticities. Our approach to parenthood was an open question we had not yet needed to answer. Instead, we filled our lives with books and rehearsals, with friends who became family, with the slow, many-layered work of being two people who chose one another again and again. Sometimes, in the half-light of our apartment, I would touch the scar the ethics of our early life had left, the faint reshaping of how we navigated authority, and feel gratitude that the damage had not been irreparable, but instructive. There were days when I would walk the halls of museums and feel a curious pride that my love story had not been an excuse for stunted work. Rather, our relationship had become part of the texture that informed my scholarship. The way light is understood in intimacy, the fragile politics of seeing, the ethics of presence. My book eventually came out with a dedication that felt truer than any preface I could write, for the person who listened beneath my sentences. The sentence was small, and anyone unfamiliar with our story would not read anything into it, but to us it was an arch that connected a past of restraint with a present of accompaniment. Catherine came to that book launch. She wore a shawl that smelled faintly of sandalwood, the same scent that had followed Sofia into that first reception years before. When she spoke, she was laconic but warm, praising the rigor of the research and the unusual way the prose married the heart and the archive. Afterwards, she pulled me aside and said quietly, "You kept your work honest. You kept yourself honest. That is all an advisor can wish for." Her words mattered not because they unmade what had been difficult, but because they recognized the labor we had both done, the labor to be ethical, to be responsible, and to be candid about the fact that love is not merely an aesthetic phenomenon, but a series of commitments and choices. We do not live in a narrative that ends neatly. There are, even now, flurries of concern about tenure decisions, about unfinished projects, about the ways public attention can sharpen or distort the private. There are quiet laments for friends lost too early, and small triumphs that steady us. But in those ordinary tensions there has been a new capacity for endurance. My work, and Sofia's music, continue to feed and demand of us. We meet those demands together more often than apart. Once, many years into our life in New Haven, I found myself under an oak that had been planted in a small park near our apartment. It was not the same oak as the one at my old university, but its branches gave me the same strange consolation. I had come to think about the way trees keep time, how they host seasons without being dramatized by them. Standing there, with a small cup of coffee cooling against my palm, I thought of the first handshake, the jasmine, the 5 months that had tried to constrain us, the accident that taught us about urgency, and the graduation that offered a path forward. Love, I have learned, is not something you are supposed to figure out perfectly at the outset. It is a practice, done imperfectly but with attention. It requires listening, often to other people's fears as much as to your own desires, and a willingness to accept boundaries that protect more than they punish. It requires courage to choose transparency over secrecy, when transparency will not annihilate the people we care about. And it requires gentleness to forgive ourselves for the moments we wish we had acted differently. In public settings now, when people ask the overly simple question of how we manage the complexity, what I find myself saying is always the same and oddly insufficient. We tried to be careful. We tried to honor the ethical weight of our position, even when our hearts were loud. We made promises, and we kept them, until they became less a rigid boundary and more a posture we could hold together. And we counted on the kind of patience that is not languid but steady, the kind a tree practices all its life. If this story moved you, like and subscribe for more true WLW stories.